not during the day, but long before dawn. Most people imagine the dawn of civilization as a time of quiet, pastoral awakenings, waking with the sun to tend the fields. But for an obsidian worker in Neolithic Anatolia, the dark hours before sunrise were just a continuation of a cold, unending grind. Sleep was never planned. It happened only when your hands finally cramped into useless claws and your eyes could no longer focus in the dim light of the hearth. By modern standards, this would be called pure exhaustion. Back then, 8,000 years ago, it was simply normal. The air in your mud-brick dwelling is heavy, choked with the white dust of crushed pumice and the smell of stale sweat. You sit cross-legged on a hardened dirt floor, the cold seeping through your thin-woven tunic, trapped in a windowless room lit only by a dying ember. You are holding a jagged chunk of black, volcanic glass. You probably wouldn't survive a week here. The dust alone coats the lungs like wet cement, and the sharp flakes of stone find their way into every meal, every breath, every blink. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment with your location and local time, marking your own quiet vigil in the dark. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are in Cataluyuk. It is roughly 6,000 BCE. Your entire existence revolves around a single, unforgiving material: obsidian. You don't build monuments. You don't hunt. You sit and you scrape. The process of making a mirror out of a rock is a testament to human vanity, or perhaps human paranoia. You start with a core of obsidian, traded from the twin-peaked volcano of Hazan Dağ, days away across the unforgiving plain. It is brutally sharp. One wrong strike with your antler-bone hammer, and the glass shatters, sending a razor-thin shard deep into your thumb. You don't flinch. You just wipe the blood on your tunic and keep working. Blood on the stone makes it slippery, and you cannot afford to drop a piece this large. It is the Neolithic equivalent of dropping your phone face down on concrete, except here there is no replacement, and your family simply starves. Your days and nights bleed into one continuous motion: grinding, polishing, sand, water, leather, repeat. You rub the surface of the black stone with a coarse grinding stone, hours upon hours, until your shoulders scream and your neck locks into a permanent, painful stoop. You are trading the marrow of your youth for a flat surface. Why go through this agonizing labor? Why sit in the dark, destroying your joints, just to make a piece of rock slightly less bumpy? A polished obsidian mirror wasn't just a tool for checking if your hair was out of place. It was survival, and failure wasn't forgiven. The elites of your settlement, the priests or the wealthy merchants, commissioned these objects. They believed the dark, glassy surface held power. If the reflection was uneven, the spirits could not see through it. More importantly, the merchant who traded 3 precious baskets of grain for it would demand his grain back. You craft perfection because the alternative is hunger. There is a bleak irony in this. You spend your entire life making objects of pure, reflective vanity, yet you are covered in a permanent layer of gray dust. You spend your days choking on filth, so a local priest can admire his own cheekbones in the dark. It is the dawn of civilization, and already the priorities are entirely in order. Chronic exhaustion wasn't named yet. There was no concept of burnout. But the mirror makers of Cataluyuk lived inside it, breathing it in with every cloud of pumice dust. Today, we complain about the glare of screens keeping us awake. You live without ever turning off the physical ache in your bones, staring into the black void of the stone until it stares back. There is something quietly tragic about working while the world sleeps, trying to drag a reflection out of a piece of cooled lava. Not heroic, not romantic, just necessary. You reach the final stage of polishing. This is the longest and most agonizing part. It is a widely accepted historical fact the Cataluyuk is the site of the world's first known mirrors, dating back over 8,000 years, crafted entirely from this highly polished obsidian. But the history books rarely mention what the polish required from the human body. To get that final, glass-like sheen, you use a slurry of water and fine clay. You rub it over the stone with a piece of soft animal hide. When the hide wears through, you use your bare palms. You rub for days. The abrasive clay acts like microscopic sandpaper. Slowly, methodically, it sands away the upper layers of your skin. It literally erases the fingerprints from your hands, leaving you with unervingly smooth, raw, pink flesh that weeps clear fluid when you clench your fists. Your hands become as featureless as the stone you are trying to perfect. Historians still argue whether these earliest mirrors were used strictly for personal grooming, or if they held a darker divinatory purpose, meant to trap souls rather than simply reflect faces. Sitting alone in the dark, your raw hands burning with every movement, you lean over the stone to inspect your work. The surface is finally smooth. It is deep, black, and highly reflective. You look down into it. But the image it returns is not the clear, bright reflection of a modern silvered mirror. Obsidian swallows light. It gives back a dark, shadowy, distorted version of the world. You stare at the face looking back at you from the depths of the stone. It is exhausted. The eyes are hollow, the skin caked in pale dust, the expression flat and numb. You have traded the skin on your palms for the privilege of seeing exactly how terrible you look. It is a terrible magic trick. You have pulled a shadow out of a stone, and the shadow happens to be you. You set the mirror down. Your hands throb with a dull, rhythmic ache. Outside, the sky begins to turn a faint, bruising purple. The settlement will wake soon. The wealthy merchant will come to claim his prize, to look at his own dark reflection and feel powerful. And you will pick up another raw, jagged piece of volcanic glass, ignoring the sting in your palms, and begin the quiet, endless work of scraping it all away again. The grinding dust of Anatolia eventually settles, swallowed by thousands of years of dirt, but the black stone remains. It simply crosses an ocean. You are now kneeling on the damp, unyielding basalt floor of a temple high above the sprawling, grid-like city of Tenochtitlan. It is the dead of night. The air here does not smell of simple, honest rock dust. It is thick and sickeningly sweet, choked with the heavy smoke of burning copal resin, stale sweat, and the sharp, coppery tang of old blood that has seeped permanently into the porous stones of the altar. You are a junior priest, which is simply a polite, formal title for someone who does all the bleeding, while the high priests take all the credit. You have been kneeling in exactly this position since the sun slipped below the horizon hours ago. Your knees have bypassed numbness and settled into a deep, radiating agony that climbs up your thighs and settles in the base of your spine. You are not permitted to shift your weight. You are not permitted to sigh. In your hands, heavy and impossibly cold, is a circular disc of polished obsidian. It is a Tezcatlipoca mirror. You are staring into the smoking mirror. You have been staring for 6 uninterrupted hours. The temple chamber is suffocatingly hot from the glowing braziers, yet the stone in your hands remains stubbornly, unnervingly cold, as if it is drawing the heat directly out of your palms and into some sunless void. Sweat drips stinging salt into your eyes, but you do not blink, and you certainly do not wipe them. You are waiting for the glass to open. You haven't slept in 3 days, which, if nothing else, makes the mandatory hallucinations much more cost-effective for the temple hierarchy. It is an accepted historical fact that the Aztec deity Tezcatlipoca, whose very name translates to smoking mirror, was one of the most feared and omnipotent gods in the Mesoamerican pantheon, and his priests used these highly polished obsidian discs to divine the future, judge the accused, and communicate with the dark. You are holding the literal eye of a god. The responsibility is crushing. If you drop it, if the fragile volcanic glass chips on the unforgiving basalt floor, the punishment will be creative, highly public and prolonged. But the eye is blind tonight. Or perhaps it is just ignoring you. You breathe in the thick gray smoke of the incense. It coats the back of your throat like a layer of grease and makes your lungs feel heavy and bruised. You are supposed to be scrying for prophecies. You are meant to see the movements of enemy armies, the coming of devastating plagues, or the promise of seasonal rain. Instead, you mostly just see your own exhausted, soot-smeared face reflecting back at you in the flickering, unsteady light of the fire. It turns out that looking into the abyss is mostly just a lot of waiting around in the dark for the abyss to do something interesting. To coax the mirror into speaking, you must prepare it. This is not a gentle matter of wiping it down with a soft chamois cloth. The stone demands a physical toll. You carefully shift your right hand, biting the inside of your cheek against the sudden spike of pain in your joints, and reach for a small, shallow clay bowl resting beside your knees. Inside is a thick, blackish-red paste. It is a mixture of pine soot and human blood. Your blood. You drew it yourself just after dusk, dragging a barbed maguey spine through your own earlobes and the tender flesh of your tongue. The wounds are still fresh. They pulse with a dull, rhythmic ache that synchronizes perfectly with the heavy thud of your heartbeat. You dip a trembling forefinger into the bowl and smear the edges of the black glass with the tacky paste. The mirror must be fed before it will show you anything of value. It is considered a literal portal to the realm of the gods, and apparently the hinges of the divine require a very specific, highly unpleasant lubricant. The gods are always hungry, and surprisingly, they never seem to crave anything easily obtainable, like a nice basket of squash. They always demand the things that hurt to give. You return your gaze to the dead center of the disk. The blood-soot mixture dulls the outer edges, making the center seem to float and recede into the darkness. The surface of the stone appears to shift, swimming slightly in the low light. The copal smoke drifts across the black glass, trapping the reflection in a hazy, suffocating veil. Is that the future unfolding? Are those the shadows of marching warriors crossing a distant plain? Or is it simply the macabre combination of severe sleep deprivation, heavy incense inhalation, and mild blood loss, playing cruel, predictable tricks on your optic nerve? You don't dare look away to find out. If the high priest enters silently from the shadows of the antechamber and catches your chin dropping to your chest, your next contribution to the temple won't just be a few drops of blood from your earlobes. It will be the heavy, beating center of your chest, offered up to the morning sun. Historians still argue whether the complex, bloody rituals surrounding these obsidian mirrors were carefully orchestrated tools of state terror designed to control a vast and restless populace, or if the priests themselves were genuinely, deeply terrified of the visions they induced. Sitting here, trembling from exhaustion in the stifling heat, staring at your own blood smeared on a cold rock, the distinction feels entirely meaningless. You are terrified either way. The terror is the only thing keeping you upright. The silence in the temple is absolute, a heavy physical weight pressing against your eardrums. It is broken only by the occasional sharp crackle of the dying brazier and your own shallow, uneven breathing. Below you, the great city sleeps, unaware of the quiet, desperate bargaining happening in the dark above them. The mirror offers you no comfort. It does not show you a flattering angle or a bright, hopeful tomorrow. It shows you the smoke. It shows you the dark. You are bound to this polished slab, tethered to it by fear, sleep deprivation, and holy duty, waiting for a deity who speaks only in silent, terrible omens. The night stretches on, entirely indifferent to your aching joints, your bleeding ears, and your fading grip on reality. You keep staring, because eventually the glass will show you something. It has to, even if it is only the slow, inevitable breaking of your own mind. The heavy, cloying smoke of the high temple eventually thins, but the suffocating heat does not break. It merely descends. It flattens out, settling heavily across the narrow, fertile ribbon of the Nile Valley. You are no longer kneeling on cold basalt. You are sitting cross-legged on a frayed reed mat in a mud brick workshop in Deir el-Medina, the artisan village of the New Kingdom. The air here is entirely devoid of mystical incense. It smells exclusively of baked river mud, the metallic tongue of roasting copper, and the sharp, sour reality of your own inescapable sweat. It is high noon outside, but the workshop is kept deliberately shuttered to keep the brutal, blinding Egyptian sun at bay. The darkness doesn't help with the temperature. It just turns the small room into a slow-cooking clay oven. In your lap, pressing heavily against your thighs, rests a solid disc of cast bronze. It has a heavy, stylized handle, shaped like a papyrus umbel, designed to fit perfectly into the delicate hand of a noblewoman. Right now, however, it is gripped in your raw, calloused hands, and it looks absolutely nothing like a luxury item. It is dull. It is a stubborn, oxidized, muddy brown. Your single consuming purpose in life is to force this dead piece of earth to look like liquid sunlight. You are equipped with a pile of incredibly fine river silt, a bowl of crushed cuttlebone, a few rags of coarse, undyed linen, and your own failing elbow joints. You dip the linen into the abrasive powder and press it against the metal. You drag it back and forth. The sound is a dry, endless rhythmic scraping that burrows directly into your skull and stays there even when you sleep. It is a widely accepted historical fact that ancient Egyptian artisans mastered the production of copper and bronze hand mirrors, shaping them into slightly flattened circles to mimic the sun disk, deeply associating the reflective surface with Hathor, the goddess of beauty, love, and light. But there is nothing beautiful or loving about the process of making one. The friction of your aggressive polishing generates heat. The thick bronze disc absorbs that heat, transferring it directly back into your lap. You are essentially holding a warm frying pan in a room that is already sweltering. You begin to sweat. This introduces a terrible, quiet irony into your labor. An obscure, deeply frustrating detail of working with bare bronze is its desperate, immediate chemical desire to return to a dull, earthy state. The salt and moisture in human sweat are highly corrosive to a fresh polish. If a single drop of sweat from your forehead falls onto the surface, you have just spent 3 hours agonizingly buffing. It instantly etches a dull, cloudy bloom into the metal. You must immediately start over, polishing away your own suffering just to maintain the baseline. You sit in the stifling dark, carefully contorting your neck and shoulders to ensure that your body drips onto the dirt floor, not onto the disc. You are fighting a war of attrition against the Earth's atmosphere, and the atmosphere has a significant tactical advantage. Every time you wipe away the abrasive paste to check your progress, the humid air of the Nile inundation season begins to quietly tarnish the metal again. You cannot stop. If you pause to rest your screaming shoulder muscles, the shine begins to die before the sun even sets outside. The fine metallic dustule, or scraping off the bronze disc, does not simply vanish. It coats the workshop. It coats your linen kilt. It settles thickly onto your skin, mixing with your sweat to form a toxic, abrasive paste that turns your hands, your arms, and your chest a sickly shimmering shade of oxidized green. You breathe it in. The back of your throat tastes permanently of old pennies and dried blood. The nobility demand a surface clear enough to perfectly apply ground malachite to their eyelids, entirely unconcerned that your own eyes are currently caked with toxic copper dust. You rub the disc with a softer piece of leather, pushing through the burning sensation in your forearms. The muddy brown slowly gives way to a dull gold, and then, agonizingly, to a bright, mirror-like finish. You can finally see a reflection. It is not the dark, shadowy void of obsidian, but a warm, golden, surprisingly sharp image. You see the green stain on your nose. You see the deep lines of exhaustion carved around your mouth. You have created a perfect, sunlit window, and all it shows you is the damage it took to make it. Historians still argue whether the most flawless, heavily gilded of these bronze mirrors were ever actually intended for daily cosmetic use by the living, or if they were crafted exclusively as funerary equipment designed to capture and hold a single, theoretical ray of sunlight inside an absolutely pitch-black tomb. You consider this as you give the bronze one final, agonizing buff. You are pouring your finite energy into an object that might spend the next 3,000 years buried in the dirt, serving absolutely no one in the suffocating dark of a necropolis. It is a grim thought. Eternity is a very long time to spend looking at yourself, especially when the bronze will inevitably turn a fuzzy, corroded green the moment the tomb is sealed anyway. You do not get to keep the light you have painstakingly dragged out of the metal. You immediately wrap the finished mirror in a piece of oiled cloth to protect it from the treacherous air, blinding it once again. You hand it to the silent overseer standing by the doorway. He nods, takes the wrapped sun disk, and silently hands you another raw, dull, heavy piece of brown metal. You adjust your posture on the frayed mat. Your knees pop. Your right shoulder emits a low, grinding click that promises a very painful old age, assuming the copper dust in your lungs allows you to reach it. You dip the coarse linen back into the crushed cuttlebone. You place your hands on the warm, stubborn metal. You do not sigh. You simply lean forward, bracing your weight, and begin the dry, endless scraping all over again, chasing a temporary shine in the unforgiving dark. The oppressive, dry heat of the bronze polishers eventually fades into history, only to be replaced by the damp, suffocating soot of a Roman provincial workshop. You are standing in the shadows of a stone-walled foundry, perhaps in Sidon or Alexandria, sometime in the 1st century. The air here does not smell of sweat and river mud. It smells of wood ash, hot sand, and a strange, heavy metallic vapor that seems to bypass your lungs and settle directly into the marrow of your bones. You are no longer grinding stone or polishing dull bronze. You are working with the newest, most volatile luxury of the ancient world, glass. In front of you is a small, glowing crucible suspended over a roaring charcoal fire. Inside the crucible, a pool of lead is melting, transforming from dull gray ingots into a trembling silver liquid. Next to the fire sits a wooden table covered in tiny, fragile discs of blown glass. You are attempting to marry fragile, imperfect glass with molten heavy metal. It is a relationship built entirely on thermal shock and mutual destruction. You pick up a pair of iron tongs. Your hands are already trembling slightly, though you tell yourself it is just the fatigue of standing over the forge since sunrise. You carefully lift the crucible. The heat radiating from the liquid lead scorches the sparse hairs on your forearms. You bring it over to the table, where one of the glass discs sits waiting, concave side up like a tiny, thirsty bowl. It is a widely accepted historical fact that the artisans of the Roman Empire, particularly in regions like Sidon, were the first to successfully back glass with molten lead to create true mirrors. Pliny the Elder wrote of them with mild fascination. But reading about the process in a comfortable villa is very different from executing it in a windowless shed. You tilt the crucible. A thin, searing ribbon of molten lead spills onto the back of the cold glass. This is the moment of failure. Glass and molten metal despise one another. If the glass is too cold, the sudden, violent heat of the lead causes the disc to fracture instantly with a sharp, terrifying crack, sending microscopic, invisible shards of glass exploding upward toward your unprotected eyes. If you are blinded by a bursting disc, at least you will be permanently spared the indignity of having to look at your own deteriorating face. But this time, the glass holds. The lead spreads across the curved surface, cooling rapidly into a dull, heavy backing. You set the crucible down and exhale. The resulting mirror is the size of a coin and completely convex. When you turn it over, the reflection it provides is entirely warped, allowing a wealthy patrician to admire a single, violently distorted pore at a time, looking like a bloated fish staring back from a tiny greenish bubble. It is a terrible reflection, full of trapped air bubbles and impurities, but it is unequivocally brighter than bronze. It is magic, and the price of this magic is simply your nervous system. You lean back over the crucible to prepare for the next pour. As the lead bubbles, it releases a faint, almost invisible vapor. You breathe it in deeply, filling your lungs with the warm air. An obscure and particularly unsettling detail of working over a lead crucible is the taste. Lead vapor does not burn the throat like wood smoke. It does not sting the eyes like sulfur. Instead, as the heavy particles settle onto the moisture of your palate, they coat your tongue with a faint, cloying sweetness. You are breathing in a heavy metal, and it tastes like a gentle, sugary confection. It is a quiet, polite sort of poison. It doesn't kill you instantly. It just slowly unspools your mind, ensuring you forget exactly why your hands are trembling in the first place. You don't know the word for plumbanism. You don't know that the lead is replacing the calcium in your bones. You only know the symptoms, though you accept them as the natural, inescapable curse of the forge. You notice the deep, chronic ache in your abdomen that never quite goes away. You notice the strange, dark blue line forming along your gums, a visible watermark of the toxicity saturating your blood. Most of all, you notice the weakness. Your wrists feel heavy, as if the bones have turned to water. Sometimes you cannot fully lift your hands. Your fingers curl inward, clumsy and uncooperative. You drop things. A glass disc shatters on the dirt floor, and the overseer strikes you across the shoulders with a hazel switch, shouting about the cost of materials. You do not argue. You simply kneel in the dirt, your joints screaming in quiet protest, and sweep up the fragments of ruined vanity. Historians still argue whether the master craftsmen of antiquity fully grasped that the sweet heavy air of the workshop was actively rotting their bodies, or if they simply viewed the creeping madness and physical collapse of metalworkers as the inevitable, unremarkable cost of doing business. Sitting here in the gloom, you certainly don't feel like a pioneer of metallurgy. You just feel old, decades before your time. You pick up the finished mirror. The lead backing has cooled, adding a surprising, satisfying weight to the tiny object. You polish the front of the convex glass with a piece of soft wool. Your reflection swims in the green-tinted depth. Your eyes look hollow, your skin pale beneath the soot. The sweet taste of the air clings to your teeth. You wrap the mirror in a scrap of leather. It will be sold in the market tomorrow, purchased by a merchant who will carry it to Rome, where a woman you will never meet will hold it up to the light to check the powder on her cheeks. She will never know what the air tasted like in the room where it was born. You turn back to the forge. The fire is dying down, requiring more charcoal. The crucible needs to be heated again. You lift the heavy iron tongs, ignoring the dull, throbbing pain in your wrist and the strange metallic fog settling over your thoughts. You have 50 more discs to coat before the overseer allows you to leave the shed. You lean over the molten metal, open your mouth, and take another long, sweet breath. The heavy, sweet taste of lead vapor eventually thins from your throat, but your lungs are offered no true relief. It is simply replaced by the sharp, brackish stink of standing salt water, rotting wood, and damp brick. You are no longer in a provincial shed in the arid desert. You are standing in the cavernous, vaulted interior of a Venetian glassworks. The stone floor beneath your worn leather shoes feels distinctly unstable, trembling with a subtle, constant vibration against the incoming tide. You are on the island of Murano, marooned in the gray, unforgiving waters of the lagoon. It is the early 15th century. The air outside is bitterly cold, saturated with a heavy winter fog that rolls stubbornly off the Adriatic Sea, chilling the city to the bone. But inside the foundry, you are trapped in a localized, inescapable purgatory. Before you sits the furnace. It is a massive, multi-tiered dome of firebrick, roaring with a deafening, continuous hunger. The noise is a physical weight, a low, rushing, hollow drone that consumes all the oxygen in the room and forces you to communicate with the other workmen entirely in sharp, economical hand gestures. There is no camaraderie here, only the shared, silent endurance of the heat. It is a widely accepted historical fact that in the year 1291, the Venetian Republic ordered all glassmakers to extinguish their city fires, pack up their specialized tools, and relocate permanently to the island of Murano. You are not a citizen of the world. You are a captive asset of the state. It is a highly exclusive island community. The exclusivity is strictly enforced by the Republica's quiet promise to assassinate you if you ever try to move away. You are allowed to make a meager wage, but you are not allowed to leave. Your task is not to make delicate goblets or decorative beads. You are tasked with producing a canvas for a mirror. This requires a flawless, flat pane of cristallo, the miraculously clear, colorless glass that has made Venice the absolute envy of the known world. But to extract a flat sheet of glass from a pool of molten liquid, you cannot simply pour it onto a table. You must blow it. You step up to the glory hole, the blindingly bright opening of the furnace crucible. The heat that rolls out of the opening is not merely hot. It is an aggressive, physical assault. It feels as though a heavy iron door has been dropped directly onto your face. Your skin instantly tightens. Your eyelashes crisp and curl backward toward your eyelids. You grip the canna, the long, heavy iron blowpipe. You dip it into the crucible, turning it steadily to gather a glowing, honey-like glob of molten silica. The iron pipe heats up instantly, burning the thick yellow calluses on your palms, but you do not let go. You pull the heavy gathering out into the ambient air and begin to blow. To create a flat mirror pane, you must first blow a massive, elongated cylinder. You stand over a narrow trench dug into the stone floor, swinging the heavy iron pipe back and forth like a pendulum. Gravity and centrifugal force drag the glowing glass downward, stretching it into a long, fragile tube. Your shoulders scream under the awkward weight. Your lower back locks into a rigid column of dull, radiating pain. You stare intently at the glowing cylinder, looking for impurities, assessing the uniform thickness of the walls. You are staring directly into a material that is radiating over 2,000 degrees of heat. This introduces an obscure and particularly unsettling detail of your profession. The furnace fire and the molten glass emit a massive, unrelenting amount of infrared radiation. This invisible energy hits your unprotected eyes hour after hour, day after day. Slowly, the intense heat literally cooks the transparent proteins in the lenses of your eyes, much like dropping a raw egg white into a hot skillet. Over the years, a dense, milky fog creeps into your peripheral vision, slowly and inevitably closing in on the center. It is a slow-motion blinding known as glassblower's cataract. You blink, trying to clear the haze that seems to permanently coat your vision, but the fog is trapped inside the eye itself. You are literally boiling away your own lenses, so that a distant nobleman can clearly examine his pores, which represents a rather unequal distribution of eyesight. You spend your entire life perfecting the absolute clarity of the cristallo, and your reward is to view the rest of your declining years through a dense, white blur. Historians still argue whether the Doge and the Council of Ten forced the glassworks to Murano purely out of a civic desire to protect the dense wooden architecture of Venice from accidental furnace fires, or if this safety mandate was simply a convenient excuse to quarantine their most lucrative human assets in a watery, heavily guarded prison. Standing here, tethered to the fire, the architectural concerns of the city feel completely irrelevant. You are a prisoner of the flame, regardless of the political justification written in the archives. You bring the heavy glass cylinder to a wooden table. With a pair of iron shears, you quickly snip off the rounded ends. Then, taking a hot iron rod, you draw a single, straight line down the length of the cooling cylinder, scoring it. You place the split cylinder into a cooler section of the furnace, the annealing oven. As the ambient heat gently softens the glass, the cylinder slowly unrolls. slumping downward until it lies completely flat against the stone. You have created a pane of glass. It is perfectly smooth, free of the warping and bubbles of the Roman era. But it is not a mirror yet. It is just a transparent window, waiting to be closed. You step back from the furnace, retreating into the damp shadows of the workshop. The sudden absence of the blinding light leaves dark, dancing spots floating across your ruined vision. Your coarse linen tunic is soaked through, heavy and clinging to your exhausted frame. You consume gallons of sour watered wine from a wooden bucket just to replace the sweat violently evaporating from your skin, essentially pickling your internal organs while the rest of you slowly bakes. Your shift is not over. Another artisan is already preparing the next gather. You wipe your face with a dirty rag, ignoring the sting of the salt in your eyes, and step back toward the roaring glory hole. You stare into the blinding yellow light, knowing exactly what it is taking from you, and you open your mouth to blow. The heavy, sweet taste of lead vapor eventually thins from your throat, but your lungs are offered no true relief. It is simply replaced by the sharp, brackish stink of standing salt water, rotting wood, and damp brick. You are no longer in a provincial shed in the arid desert. You are standing in the cavernous, vaulted interior of a Venetian glassworks. The stone floor beneath your worn leather shoes feels distinctly unstable, trembling with a subtle, constant vibration against the incoming tide. You are on the island of Murano, marooned in the gray, unforgiving waters of the lagoon. It is the early 15th century. The air outside is bitterly cold, saturated with a heavy winter fog that rolls stubbornly off the Adriatic Sea, chilling the city to the bone. But inside the foundry, you are trapped in a localized, inescapable purgatory. Before you sits the furnace. It is a massive, multi-tiered dome of firebrick, roaring with a deafening, continuous hunger. The noise is a physical weight, a low, rushing, hollow drone that consumes all the oxygen in the room and forces you to communicate with the other workmen entirely in sharp, economical hand gestures. There is no camaraderie here, only the shared, silent endurance of the heat. It is a widely accepted historical fact that in the year 1291, the Venetian Republic ordered all glassmakers to extinguish their city fires, pack up their specialized tools, and relocate permanently to the island of Murano. You are not a citizen of the world. You are a captive asset of the state. It is a highly exclusive island community. The exclusivity is strictly enforced by the Republica's quiet promise to assassinate you if you ever try to move away. You are allowed to make a meager wage, but you are not allowed to leave. Your task is not to make delicate goblets or decorative beads. You are tasked with producing a canvas for a mirror. This requires a flawless, flat pane of cristallo, the miraculously clear, colorless glass that has made Venice the absolute envy of the known world. But to extract a flat sheet of glass from a pool of molten liquid, you cannot simply pour it onto a table. You must blow it. You step up to the glory hole, the blindingly bright opening of the furnace crucible. The heat that rolls out of the opening is not merely hot. It is an aggressive, physical assault. It feels as though a heavy iron door has been dropped directly onto your face. Your skin instantly tightens. Your eyelashes crisp and curl backward toward your eyelids. You grip the canna, the long, heavy iron blowpipe. You dip it into the crucible, turning it steadily to gather a glowing, honey-like glob of molten silica. The iron pipe heats up instantly, burning the thick yellow calluses on your palms, but you do not let go. You pull the heavy gathering out into the ambient air and begin to blow. To create a flat mirror pane, you must first blow a massive, elongated cylinder. You stand over a narrow trench dug into the stone floor, swinging the heavy iron pipe back and forth like a pendulum. Gravity and centrifugal force drag the glowing glass downward, stretching it into a long, fragile tube. Your shoulders scream under the awkward weight. Your lower back locks into a rigid column of dull, radiating pain. You stare intently at the glowing cylinder, looking for impurities, assessing the uniform thickness of the walls. You are staring directly into a material that is radiating over 2,000 degrees of heat. This introduces an obscure and particularly unsettling detail of your profession. The furnace fire and the molten glass emit a massive, unrelenting amount of infrared radiation. This invisible energy hits your unprotected eyes hour after hour, day after day. Slowly, the intense heat literally cooks the transparent proteins in the lenses of your eyes, much like dropping a raw egg white into a hot skillet. Over the years, a dense, milky fog creeps into your peripheral vision, slowly and inevitably closing in on the center. It is a slow-motion blinding known as glassblower's cataract. You blink, trying to clear the haze that seems to permanently coat your vision, but the fog is trapped inside the eye itself. You are literally boiling away your own lenses so that a distant nobleman can clearly examine his pores, which represents a rather unequal distribution of eyesight. You spend your entire life perfecting the absolute clarity of the cristallo, and your reward is to view the rest of your declining years through a dense, white blur. Historians still argue whether the Doge and the Council of Ten forced the glassworks to Murano purely out of a civic desire to protect the dense wooden architecture of Venice from accidental furnace fires, or if this safety mandate was simply a convenient excuse to quarantine their most lucrative human assets in a watery, heavily guarded prison. Standing here, tethered to the fire, the architectural concerns of the city feel completely irrelevant. You are a prisoner of the flame, regardless of the political justification written in the archives. You bring the heavy glass cylinder to a wooden table. With a pair of iron shears, you quickly snip off the rounded ends. Then, taking a hot iron rod, you draw a single straight line down the length of the cooling cylinder, scoring it. You place the split cylinder into a cooler section of the furnace, the annealing oven. As the ambient heat gently softens the glass, the cylinder slowly unrolls, slumping downward until it lies completely flat against the stone. You have created a pane of glass. It is perfectly smooth, free of the warping and bubbles of the Roman era. But it is not a mirror yet. It is just a transparent window, waiting to be closed. You step back from the furnace, retreating into the damp shadows of the workshop. The sudden absence of the blinding light leaves dark, dancing spots floating across your ruined vision. Your coarse linen tunic is soaked through, heavy and clinging to your exhausted frame. You consume gallons of sour watered wine from a wooden bucket just to replace the sweat violently evaporating from your skin, essentially pickling your internal organs while the rest of you slowly bakes. Your shift is not over. Another artisan is already preparing the next gather. You wipe your face with a dirty rag, ignoring the sting of the salt in your eyes, and step back toward the roaring glory hole. You stare into the blinding yellow light, knowing exactly what it is taking from you, and you open your mouth to blow. You step out of the unventilated silvering room and pull your thin, heavy wool cloak tight against your throat. The shift is finally over. The cold, suffocating fog of the Venetian winter rolls off the lagoon, wrapping the island of Murano in a dense, damp shroud. You breathe in deeply. The air in the alleyway smells heavily of rotting seaweed, raw sewage, and stale wood smoke. It is a foul, stagnant stench, but after 12 hours of inhaling the sterile, silent rot of vaporized mercury, you welcome the smell of the open canal. It reminds you that you are still, technically, alive. You begin the slow walk back to your cramped, unheated quarters. Your leather boots slip slightly on the slick, algae-coated cobblestones. Your hands are thrust deep into your pockets, primarily to keep them warm against the biting Adriatic wind, but also to hide the violent, involuntary tremors that have become your permanent companions. You keep your head down. You do not make eye contact with the few other figures moving through the mist. In Venice, looking someone in the eye is an invitation to conversation, and conversation is currently the most dangerous activity you can engage in. You possess the recipe for the mercury tin amalgam. You know the exact temperature required to keep the cristallo from shattering when it leaves the blowpipe. You hold the chemical equations of vanity in your bleeding, spongy gums. Because of this, your brain is no longer your private property. It is a highly classified state asset. It is a widely accepted historical fact that the Venetian Republic, c. Council of Ten, passed draconian laws explicitly forbidding any registered glassmaker from crossing the borders of the state. If you left, your immediate family would be quietly rounded up and thrown into the pubi, the lead-roofed prisons of the Doge's palace, to suffer and bake until you returned. If you still refused to come back, the state promised to dispatch an assassin to slit your throat wherever you had chosen to settle. It is a rare and distinct privilege to know your employer values your specific skill set so highly that they will legally mandate your murder if you attempt to submit your resignation. Most common laborers can only dream of securing that level of corporate retention. You turn a narrow corner, the high brick walls closing in around you, blocking out the faint moonlight. The silence of the island is profound, broken only by the rhythmic, hollow slapping of black water against the stone foundations. You hear a footstep behind you. It is a soft, wet sound, just slightly out of rhythm with your own. You do not run. Running implies guilt, and guilt is all the justification the Republic needs. You simply stiffen your aching shoulders and maintain your pace, your heart hammering a frantic, exhausting rhythm against your ribs. You casually cross the narrow footbridge over a minor canal, risking a subtle glance over your shoulder as you reach the apex of the arch. The alley behind you is empty. It was just the echo of your own exhausted boots bouncing off the damp brick. The mercury poisoning makes you terribly, irrationally paranoid. But the worst part of the paranoia is knowing that, in this specific city, your delusions are entirely justified. An obscure and particularly unsettling detail of Venetian espionage is the presence of the Bocca di Leone, the lions' mouths. These are literal stone faces carved into the walls of the city, their mouths fashioned into narrow slots. They serve as public letterboxes for anonymous denunciations. Anyone can write down a suspicion, fold the parchment, and slip it between the stone teeth. The state inquisitors read every single one. You cannot even complain about your rotting teeth or the meager wages to the man working the furnace beside you. You know with absolute certainty that he might gladly drop a note into the lion's mouth, trading your life for the price of a decent pair of boots or a momentary favor from the overseer. The silence of the factory floor merely extends into the taverns, into the streets, and into your own home. You live in a panopticon of neighbors. You police yourself, swallowing your bitter complaints, just as you swallow your improperly chewed food. Historians still argue whether the legendary assassins of the Republic, the notorious Bravi, actually tracked down and murdered defecting master craftsmen across the borders of France and Bohemia, or if the Council merely cultivated a highly successful terrifying myth to achieve the exact same compliance without the logistical burden of travel expenses. Sitting in the dark, wondering if the man leaning against the canal bridge is a fisherman or a state executioner, the academic distinction feels entirely useless. The fear works perfectly either way. You don't test the borders. You don't even look at the boats heading toward the mainland. You watch a diseased pigeon limp across a small, empty piazza, picking desperately at a discarded fish spine. You realize, with a quiet, dull resentment, that the scavenging bird possesses significantly more diplomatic immunity and freedom of movement than a master of the Glass Guild. The bird can fly to Milan tomorrow. If you try to row to the mainland, you will be intercepted by the night patrols and drowned quietly in the lagoon. You finally reach the heavy wooden door of your lodging. You fumble with the iron key, your trembling hands struggling to find the keyhole in the dark. You push inside and slide the heavy iron bolt shut, locking yourself into a room that smells faintly of mildew and a toxic apron you hung on a peg by the door. You collapse onto your narrow, straw-stuffed mattress without removing your boots. You are safe from the assassins for tonight. You have survived another day without whispering the secret of the silvering room to a spy. But as you lie in the freezing dark, listening to your own shallow breathing, you realize the trap is absolute. The mirror you crafted today is already packed in sawdust, loaded onto a merchant galley, and sailing freely toward the bright, opulent courts of Europe. Your work travels the world, reflecting the faces of kings. You, however, remain in the damp dark, a permanent prisoner of the very reflection you created. You are no longer in the damp, claustrophobic alleys of Murano. The oppressive, stagnant fog of the lagoon has been replaced by the razor-sharp, violently moving air of the high Alps. It is the dead of night. There is no moon, only the disorienting, pale luminescence of endless snow stretching upward into the crushing dark. You are wading waist-deep through a frozen drift that feels less like crystallized water and more like crushed glass grinding methodically against your numb thighs. You have traded the suffocating heat of the glass furnace for a cold so absolute it burns the lining of your lungs with every ragged breath. You are following the shadowy, indistinct outline of a smuggler, a man you paid with a small bag of stolen silver coins, who has not spoken a single word to you in 3 days. He walks with the infuriating, steady rhythm of someone who belongs in the mountains. You stumble behind him with the clumsy, desperate panic of a man who belongs in a grave. You have successfully escaped the slow, agonizing death of the silvering room, only to invite the very immediate, highly efficient death of a Venetian assassin's. Blade in the dark, which from a strictly bureaucratic standpoint is a remarkable acceleration of your career path. You are a fugitive. It is a widely accepted historical fact that in the 1660s, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the relentlessly ambitious finance minister to King Louis XIV of France, launched a covert economic war against Venice. Colbert deployed a network of spies to bribe, smuggle, and occasionally kidnap master glassmakers, desperate to break the Republic's absolute monopoly on mirrors and establish a domestic industry for his king. You are one of Colbert's stolen assets, a walking repository of state secrets, carefully traversing a lethal, icy tightrope. The French agents promised you gold, a warm workshop in Paris, and the protection of the crown. But the French agents are not here right now. They are sitting in comfortable, fire-lit drawing rooms, sipping warm wine while you drag your failing, toxic body up a vertical sheet of ice. The wind howls down the narrow mountain pass, whipping sharp granules of ice directly into your unprotected eyes. The Republic of Venice strictly forbids you from crossing its borders, but the alpine blizzard currently attempting to strip the flesh from your face seems entirely indifferent to your legal jurisdiction, perfectly willing to freeze you to death, regardless of your guild standing. You pull your heavy wool cloak tighter around your shoulders, though it offers no real protection. The fabric is frozen stiff, snapping against your calves like a wooden board. You cannot feel your toes. You cannot feel your fingers. You are entirely unsure if you are still gripping the small, leather-wrapped bundle of specialized tools you managed to steal from the factory, or if you dropped it miles ago in the darkness. You do not stop to check. If you stop moving, even for a moment, the cold will pull you down into the snow, and you will simply go to sleep forever. You lean heavily against a massive, sheer wall of granite to catch your breath. Your chest heaves, but the thin mountain air offers no oxygen, only a sharp, stabbing pain beneath your ribs. You are shaking violently. This introduces an obscure and deeply unsettling detail of your escape. You cannot determine the exact source of your own suffering. The symptoms of severe hypothermia are nearly identical to the advanced stages of mercury poisoning. Your teeth chatter so hard you fear they will crack, and your hands vibrate with rapid, uncontrollable tremors. You do not know if you are shaking because the ambient temperature is 20 degrees below freezing, or simply because your central nervous system is finally snapping under the cumulative weight of the heavy metals you absorbed last month. It is a terrible physical ambiguity, leaving you to guess which invisible force is currently trying to shut down your heart. You push away from the rock and follow the smuggler's fading footprints. You must keep the secret safe. The precise ratio of tin to quicksilver. The exact temperature of the annealing oven. You are currently smuggling the most valuable intellectual property in the European economy inside a brain that is actively dissolving into paranoid mush, effectively making your skull the least structurally sound bank vault in the history of corporate espionage. Every shadow cast by the jagged peaks looks like a Venetian bravo stepping out with a drawn stiletto. Your poisoned mind amplifies the isolation. You hear footsteps crunching in the snow right behind you, but when you wildly turn your head, throwing yourself off balance and plunging face first into a drift, there is nothing there but the wind. You weep silently into the snow, the tears instantly freezing to your eyelashes, sealing your eyes half shut. Historians still argue whether the rash of sudden agonizing deaths among these smuggled Venetian artisans in Paris a few years later was truly the result of the Doge's assassins successfully slipping poison into their wine, or if the men simply collapsed from the inevitable catastrophic organ, failure guaranteed by a lifetime of inhaling quicksilver. As you drag your dead, frozen legs up the final incline of the pass, you realize the answer does not matter. The Republic does not need to send an assassin with a dagger. The Republic already sent the assassin inside your own blood. You reach the crest of the mountain. The smuggler has stopped, pointing a thick-gloved finger downward into the black valley below. France. You stand at the border, swaying slightly in the vicious wind. You have survived the crossing. You have beaten the Venetian blockade. You will soon descend into the warmth of the French lowlands. You will be given a new leather apron, a new marble table, and a new pile of tin foil. You will walk into a brand new, unventilated room, pour out a fresh flask of liquid mercury, and begin the exact same slow, toxic suicide, just under a different flag. You look down into the dark abyss of your new homeland. You do not feel triumph. You do not feel relief. You only feel the cold metal waiting for you at the bottom. You lower your head, take a shallow, freezing breath, and begin the long, agonizing descent into the dark. The freezing wind of the Alpine Pass eventually thaws, leaving you in a climate that is vastly more opulent, but entirely devoid of fresh air. You are standing on a precarious wooden scaffold in the heart of the Isle de France. The year is 1684. You are in a gallery that is hundreds of feet long, lined with soaring arched windows on one side and blind arcades on the other. But the arcades are not blind anymore. They are blinding. You are in the Palace of Versailles. Specifically, you are breathing the stagnant, heavy air of the Galerie des Glaces, the Hall of Mirrors. The French agents who smuggled you out of Venice delivered exactly what they promised: a warm workshop. In fact, standing directly beneath the massive vaulted ceiling in the height of summer, with the sun glaring through the massive windows and reflecting off the glass, it is excruciatingly hot. You are sweating through your coarse linen shirt, pressing your exhausted weight against a towering slab of glass to secure it into its gilded bronze mount. It is a widely accepted historical fact that the Hall of Mirrors was designed by the architect Jules Hardouin Mansart to serve as the ultimate projection of Louis XIV's absolute power, utilizing exactly 357 individual mirrors to reflect the sprawling manicured gardens and the glory of the Sun King himself. Before this gallery was built, mirrors were small, highly guarded treasures kept in private velvet boxes. Here, they are architectural wallpaper. It is an act of unfathomable, arrogant wealth, and you are the one slowly dying to paste it to the wall. You reach into your heavy leather pouch for a small vial of quicksilver and a tin patching tool. Sometimes, during the brutal transport from the Paris manufactory over the rutted, muddy roads to Versailles, the amalgam on the back of the glass cracks or flakes. Your job is to perform localized silvering repairs, high up on the walls. You smear the toxic paste onto the back of the glass with your bare thumb. You have traded the total collapse of your central nervous system just so a monarch can accurately verify the alignment of his silk stockings as he walks to chapel. It is a spectacular pinnacle of human achievement. An obscure and deeply unsettling detail of the Hall of Mirrors is what happens to it when the heavy wooden doors are closed. The mercury tin amalgam does not simply cure and become inert. In the stifling, unventilated heat of the gallery, especially when the afternoon sun turns the corridor into a monumental greenhouse, the backing of the mirrors actively off-gases. Invisible plumes of mercury vapor detach from the walls and pool heavily in the stagnant air. You breathe it in deeply as you work. The architect designed 17 massive windows to let in the divine light of the sun, but entirely forgot to design a system to let out the poison, which is a fairly standard approach to royal planning. You are trapped in a beautifully gilded, incredibly expensive gas chamber. The air grows so thick and metallic by mid-afternoon that the light itself seems to curdle, taking on a hazy, oppressive weight in your lungs. Your physical deterioration has accelerated rapidly since you crossed the Alps. The cold mountain air had merely paused the rot. The stifling heat of the French court has forced it into a rapid bloom. You can no longer hide the tremors in your hands. When you attempt to lift a tin cup of water, half of it sloshes onto your dirty tunic before it reaches your cracked lips. Your teeth ache with a constant, throbbing pressure, and several have already fallen out, leaving dark, empty gaps in your mouth. You look like a starving, toothless old man, despite barely being 30. You are actively dissolving to create permanence. You step down from the scaffold, your legs shaking with the familiar, terrible weakness. You press yourself into the deep shadows of a marble pilaster as the doors at the end of the gallery swing open. The court is moving through. A wave of suffocating perfume, heavy musks, civet paste, and decaying floral waters washes over you, momentarily masking the sharp, battery acid taste of the mercury on your tongue. Hundreds of courtiers glide past. They do not look at you. You are wearing a dirt-stained apron. Your skin is a sickly, pallid gray, and your gums are bleeding sluggishly. You are simply part of the machinery of the palace, as invisible as the wooden beams holding up the painted ceiling. They look only at the walls. They look at themselves. They preen, they whisper. They adjust their heavily powdered wigs in the flawless reflections you have sacrificed your mind to create. They are entirely oblivious to the fact that the very walls they are admiring are slowly exhaling a neurotoxin directly into their lungs. The mirrors are quietly eating the court, one breath at a time. You watch the Sun King himself pass by. Louis XIV has not cast a shadow in this room. The light bounces too frantically from wall to window and back again. He looks magnificent, radiating absolute authority. You lean against the cold marble, your hands vibrating against the stone, and you realize that dying for the glory of France pays exactly the same as dying for the Republic of Venice, but the uniforms of your superiors are undeniably more elaborate. Historians still argue whether the staggering mortality rate of the glassworkers and laborers constructing Versailles was quietly and deliberately suppressed by the royal accountants to maintain the pristine illusion of a divine, effortless creation, or if the bureaucracy simply lost track of the bodies sinking into the swampy mud of the construction site. Standing here, coughing a thick metallic phlegm into a soiled rag, you know that the ledgers do not matter. The palace demands a toll. It is extracting it directly from your bones. The court passes, disappearing through the doors at the far end of the gallery. The heavy silence returns, broken only by the sharp clink of your tools as you climb back up the wooden scaffold. You look directly into the mirror you just repaired. The flaw is gone. The glass is perfect. But the face looking back at you is a ruin. Your eyes are sunken, yellowed, and darting with the irrational, creeping paranoia of the erethism. Every time you look down the corridor, you see 1,000 copies of yourself reflected in the opposing glass, each one trembling, each one dying slightly faster than the last. The sheer repetition of your own misery is a unique kind of psychological torture. You place your trembling hand flat against the cold silvered glass. On the other side of this thin, fragile barrier is the reflection of the greatest palace on earth, a golden illusion of infinity and power. But on this side, where your hand rests, there is only the dark, the heavy metal, and the slow, quiet erosion of your life. You pick up the tin foil. You uncap the flask of mercury. You do not complain. You simply go back to work, ensuring the illusion remains absolutely flawless for the next time the king decides to take a walk. The toxic, gilded greenhouse of Versailles eventually collapses under the weight of its own arrogance, but the mirrors themselves survive, multiplying and spreading across the English Channel. The air you breathe now is no longer saturated with vaporized heavy metals, but it offers no real comfort. It is simply freezing. You are standing in the cavernous, drafty drawing room of a sprawling English country house. It is the middle of the 19th century. It is 4 a.m. The hearths are completely dead, and the damp chill of the Yorkshire moors has seeped directly through the stone walls and into the marrow of your shins. You are a housemaid. Your hands are already plunged into a wooden bucket of painfully cold water. You are armed with a few rags of coarse linen and a gritty paste made of crushed chalk and cheap gin and spirit, far too valuable to be wasted on your own miserable stomach, but perfectly suited for cutting through the greasy fog of aristocratic breath. Your task is to clean the glass. It is a widely accepted historical fact that the grand domestic interiors of the 18th and 19th centuries relied heavily on the architectural invention of the pier glass. These were massive towering mirrors, specifically engineered to be placed between tall windows, designed to catch the meager, gray English daylight and bounce it into the gloomy corners of the room, or to double the staggering expense of 100 burning beeswax candles at night. They are not merely objects of vanity. They are functional engines of light, and they are currently filthy. The Industrial Revolution is churning outside, filling the sky with coal smoke, and the fireplaces inside are doing the exact same thing. A fine, greasy layer of black soot settles on every horizontal and vertical surface of the house overnight. You step up to the massive pier glass. The glass stretches from the heavy mahogany skirting board to the 12-foot plaster ceiling, designed primarily to capture the sweeping hem of a silk ball gown, and secondarily to remind you of your own absolute vertical insignificance. You dip your rag into the freezing gin and chalk mixture. You raise your arm above your head and press the cloth against the glass. You drag it down in a long, sweeping arc. The physical mechanics of your labor are a quiet, agonizing endurance test. Holding your arms above your heart for hours at a time drains the blood from your fingertips, leaving them numb, white, and completely devoid of sensation. A deep, burning ache takes root in your deltoids and the base of your neck. You ignore it. You step onto a small wooden stool to reach the upper corners, your damp skirts clinging heavily to your freezing ankles. The wet chalk paste dries on your knuckles, cracking your raw skin and settling deep into the fissures, making your hands look as though they are slowly turning into brittle, crumbling porcelain. But the physical pain is entirely secondary to the psychological discipline required for the task. You are standing inches away from a flawless, towering reflection of yourself, but you are strictly, absolutely forbidden to look into it. Historians still argue whether the strict unspoken rule forbidding domestic servants from making eye contact with their own reflections in the master's mirrors was rooted in a lingering, superstitious dread that a commoner might leave a permanent spiritual smudge on the glass, or if it was simply a cold, calculated mechanism to enforce absolute social invisibility. To pause your labor and gaze upon your own face would be an act of vanity, and vanity implies that you possess a self worth looking at. You do not. You are a tool that cleans other tools. So you perfect the art of the unfocused stare. You train your eyes to look at the surface of the glass, actively searching for streaks of soot and smears of oil, while willfully refusing to look into the depth of the mirror. You see your hands moving. You see the rough fabric of your sleeve. But you blur out the exhausted, pale face hovering just behind the rag. You are actively participating in your own erasure. It is a severe daily exercise in unbeing. An obscure and particularly unsettling detail of these massive antique mirrors is a phenomenon known as foxing. As the heavy glass ages in the damp, unheated environment of an English manor, the volatile metallic backing, whether old mercury amalgam or early silver nitrate, begins to quietly fail. It oxidizes, creating dark, jagged, decaying black spots that bloom deep within the glass. They look like mold growing inside a frozen pond. You scrub at these dark spots with your freezing, chalk-covered rag. You press so hard your wrists pop, desperately trying to polish away the shadow. But the rot is on the inside. It is entirely unreachable. You are blamed for these dark spots, of course. The housekeeper insists you are simply not rubbing hard enough, a philosophy that Victorian management confidently applies to entirely unfixable problems, from failing mirror backing to structural poverty. You accept the scolding in silence, keeping your head bowed, because attempting to explain the chemical degradation of silver amalgam to a woman who inspects your fingernails for dust is a thoroughly losing battle. You move to the next pier glass, then the heavy, gilded mirror over the mantelpiece, then the oval glass in the master's dressing room. Your shoulders burn with a low, continuous fire. Your fingertips are bleeding sluggishly into the cold water bucket, the gin stinging the open cuts with a sharp, biting clarity. The gray light of dawn finally begins to filter through the heavy velvet curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the freezing air. The mirrors are finally clean. They stand like tall, flawless sentinels in the quiet room, reflecting the empty chairs, the cold hearths, and the vast, silent wealth of the estate. The glass is completely clear of soot, grease, and fog. You step back, lowering your heavy, aching arms. You allow your eyes to drift, just for a fraction of a second, toward the towering glass. You see a momentary blurry flash of a woman in a damp, gray uniform, her shoulders slumped, her youth quietly evaporating into the cold air. You quickly avert your eyes, terrified of your own ghost. You pick up your heavy wooden bucket, the dirty water sloshing against your numb legs, and retreat backward into the dark servants' corridor before the family wakes up to admire themselves. The freezing, drafty silence of the English manor house eventually gives way to a very different kind of cold. You are no longer scrubbing soot from the surface of glass. You are standing in the dimly lit, aggressively sterile environment of a mid-19th century laboratory, perhaps somewhere in Germany or France. The air here does not smell of gin and chalk. It smells sharply of ammonia, distilled water, and the metallic, slightly sweet tongue of a chemical reaction that is actively attempting to strip the lining from your nasal passages. You are wearing a heavy, stained rubber apron that reaches your boots. Your hands are encased in thick, clumsy protective gloves. You are an assistant to a chemist, which means you handle all the caustic, volatile substances while the chemist observes the results from a very safe distance, usually behind a heavy wooden desk, sipping a cup of tepid tea. Before you sits a massive, perfectly flat pane of plate glass, suspended precisely level over a shallow wooden trough. You are about to participate in the silver nitrate revolution. It is a widely accepted historical fact that in 1835, the German chemist Justus von Liebig developed a method to apply a thin layer of pure metallic silver directly onto glass, rendering the toxic, maddening mercury tin amalgam completely obsolete. This new chemical process was faster, cheaper, and exponentially safer. But safer, in 1835, is a highly relative term. It simply means you are no longer guaranteed a slow, agonizing death from neurological collapse. You are now only risking sudden, localized chemical burns and the very real possibility of a violent explosion. You pick up a large glass beaker filled with a clear liquid. This is the silver nitrate solution. It looks exactly like water. But an obscure and deeply unsettling detail of working with silver nitrate is what it does to human skin. If a single drop of this clear liquid splashes past your heavy gloves and lands on your wrist, it doesn't immediately burn. It waits. When exposed to light, the silver nitrate reacts with the proteins in your skin, oxidizing rapidly. A few hours later, a deep, indelible black stain will bloom across your flesh. It looks exactly as if you have been branded with black ink, but the stain cannot be scrubbed away with soap, lye, or pumice. It is chemically bonded to your cells. You must wait weeks for the stained skin to literally die, flake off, and be replaced. The hands of every laboratory assistant in Europe are currently dyed a mottled, permanent black, marking them as the disposable shock troops of the chemical age. But the stained skin is the least of your immediate concerns. You must mix the silver nitrate with a reducing agent often, an aldehyde or a sugar solution, and a precise amount of ammonia. This is the precarious part. You carefully unstopper a smaller vial of ammonia. The fumes hit you like a physical blow to the face, forcing your eyes to water instantly and your throat to seize in a violent, involuntary spasm. You hold your breath, your chest tight with a dull, aching panic, and begin to pour the ammonia into the silver solution. This creates Talon's reagent. It is an incredibly delicate, unstable chemical balancing act. If you add too much ammonia, the reaction fails. If you add too little, the silver precipitates out as a useless, muddy brown sludge. But if you leave the mixed solution sitting in the beaker for too long, or if the glassware is not meticulously clean, a much more dramatic failure occurs. The mixture can spontaneously form silver nitride, a highly sensitive explosive compound, historically referred to as fulminating silver. Historians still argue whether the occasional deafening detonations that blew the windows out of early silvering workshops were the result of careless apprentices miscalculating the ammonia ratios, or if the unstable chemistry simply reacted to a sudden change in temperature or a stray vibration from a passing carriage. Standing directly over the beaker, holding your breath while your eyes stream with ammonia tears, the distinction feels entirely academic. You are holding a potential bomb, and your only defense is to pour it quickly. You lift the heavy beaker, your black-stained, gloved hands shaking slightly, and begin to pour the volatile mixture evenly across the surface of the flat glass pane. The reaction is almost immediate, and it is undeniably beautiful. The clear liquid hits the glass and spreads. Within seconds, a dark, cloudy film begins to form, creeping across the surface like a fast-moving shadow. Then, miraculously, the shadow turns silver. A flawless, brilliantly reflective layer of pure metallic silver precipitates out of the liquid and bonds directly to the glass. You watch the transformation, mesmerized despite the burning in your eyes. You have just conjured a mirror out of water and chemicals. The reflection it offers is warmer, slightly brighter, and infinitely more precise than the old heavy mercury mirrors of Murano and Versailles. You gently tip the glass pane, allowing the excess liquid, now a toxic, ammoniacal soup, to drain into the wooden trough below. The smell intensifies, forcing you to step back and finally take a gasping, ragged breath of the foul laboratory air. Your chest heaves. Your gloves are slick with the chemical runoff. You look down at the wooden trough, watching the leftover silver sludge pool and settle. It is a messy, stinging, highly precarious process. You have survived the mixing. You have survived the pour. The glass did not shatter from thermal shock, and the beaker did not detonate in your face. You look up at the newly silvered glass. The chemical reaction is complete. The surface is a perfect, unbroken sheet of silver. You see your own reflection staring back at you. Your face is pale, your eyes are red and streaming, and the black stains on your neck, where a stray drop splashed you last week, look like a creeping necrotic disease. You have created the sharpest, most accurate reflection in human history, and it is currently showing you exactly what the chemicals are doing to your body. You set the empty beaker down with a heavy, deliberate clink. The chemist watches from his desk, nods once in approval, and turns back to his notes. You turn back to the trough, pick up a coarse rag, and begin the slow, stinging work of cleaning up the toxic spill, preparing the table for the next volatile pour. The sharp, localized chemical burns of the silvering laboratory finally fade into the past, swallowed entirely by the sheer, crushing scale of 20th century mechanization. You are no longer leaning delicately over a single pane of fragile glass in a quiet, damp room. You are standing on a grated steel walkway, suspended high above a cavernous factory floor in the American Midwest, sometime in the late 1920s. The air here does not smell of ammonia, old soot, or expensive pine resin. It smells aggressively of vaporized machine oil, hot iron, and the sharp electrical tang of ozone. Most importantly, the environment is entirely devoid of silence. Below you is the machine. It does not have a formal name, only a function. It is a continuous ribbon process, pouring an unbroken river of molten glass from a massive roaring furnace directly through a series of heavy, water-cooled iron rollers. The heat radiating upward through the steel grates hits you like a physical wall, thick and suffocating. It instantly cracks your lips, the skin splitting in fine, painful lines, and it evaporates the moisture from your eyes before you can even blink. You learn to keep your eyes half closed, viewing the industrial world through a permanent, defensive squint. You do not shape the glass. You do not blow it. You are not an artisan anymore. You are simply a biological sensor placed here because a mechanical thermostat was slightly too expensive. Your job is to watch the ribbon. It is a wide, glowing orange tongue of liquid fire that slowly cools into a dull, flat gray as it crawls endlessly down the line. It moves at a creeping, hypnotic pace. You hold a long, heavy steel rod. If a dark slag impurity or a massive air bubble appears in the glowing river, you are supposed to hook it out. It is a repetitive exercise in staring directly into the sun while standing inside an active oven. It is a widely accepted historical fact that the invention of the continuous ribbon process revolutionized plate glass, manufacturing transforming glass from a batch-made luxury item into an endless cheap industrial commodity that could wrap the new skyscrapers of the modern world in flawless reflections. The machine never stops. It runs day and night, pouring a single sheet of glass that is, theoretically, miles long. You are merely standing beside a very small, very hot segment of infinity. The noise is total. It is a deep, mechanical roar that vibrates directly through the steel grates, travels up through the heavy rubber soles of your boots, and settles deeply into your jawbone, rattling your teeth. The ringing in your ears has become so permanent that you have begun to casually accept it as the natural acoustic frequency of the universe. You cannot speak to the man standing 20 feet away from you. You do not even try. You communicate in slow, exhausted nods, sharing the profound, silent camaraderie of the thoroughly defeated. As the glass cools and moves further down the line, it must be ground and polished flat on both sides. This requires massive rotating iron discs and a continuous flood of liquid abrasive, a thick slurry of water, fine sand, and jeweler's rouge. An obscure and deeply unsettling detail of this continuous grinding process is the insidious nature of the slurry mist. The massive rotating pads throw a microscopic, abrasive fog high into the factory air. You breathe it in, coating your lungs in a fine layer of silica. But worse is what it does to the outside of your body. The fine mist of pulverized glass and wet iron dust settles onto your heavy cotton work clothes. The ambient heat of the factory bakes the moisture out of it. Over the course of a 12-hour shift, this slurry hardens in the damp creases of your elbows, behind your knees, and across your chest. It turns your uniform into a heavy, abrasive cast that actively grinds away your skin with every movement you make. You are being slowly sanded down by the very material you are supposed to be polishing. You wipe a heavy, oil-stained rag across your cracked lips. The rag is stiff with the same abrasive dust, effectively acting like rough sandpaper against your mouth. You taste copper. You swallow dryly, staring back down at the glowing orange river. Historians still argue whether the relentless deafening rhythm of the continuous production line was intentionally designed to break the psychological will of the workforce ensuring absolute compliance, or if the complete erasure of the human soul was just a happy accidental byproduct. Industrial efficiency. Standing on the grate, watching the identical inches of glass roll by for the 10,000th time today, you lean toward the latter. The machine doesn't hate you. The machine simply doesn't know you exist. Your mind begins to quietly untether itself from your body. You enter a waking coma, a necessary psychological defense against the crushing, heavy monotony. You watch the glass. You step forward, extending the heavy steel rod, and blindly hook a dark impurity out of the molten surface. You pull it back, dropping the glowing slag into a metal bin. The heat scorches your heavy leather gloves. You step back. You stare. You do this hundreds of times a shift, thousands of times a month. The glass goes to Chicago, to New York, to Detroit. It becomes shop windows, car windshields, and towering mirrors in grand hotel lobbies. The scale of the production is so vast that it completely severs any connection between the maker and the object. The artisans of Venice knew the exact weight and curve of the mirrors they coaxed from the fire. You know absolutely nothing about the glass beneath you. Once it passes your station, it is dead to you. You are mass-producing anonymity. When a man in a skyscraper looks into a polished wall of plate glass to straighten his tie, there is no ghost of your labor haunting the reflection. The sheer volume of the output has finally scrubbed the human fingerprint away entirely. The physical toll is no longer the acute, traumatic poisoning of mercury or silver nitrate. It is a dull, blunt force trauma of repetition. The arches of your feet collapse. The cartilage in your knees compresses. Your lower back develops a tight, radiating pain that never fully releases, even when you finally lie down on your narrow mattress at home. Your only real contribution to the modern age is making sure the river of molten sand doesn't accidentally overflow and incinerate the break room. The shift whistle finally blows. It is a high, shrieking blast of pressurized steam that barely manages to cut through the low, industrial roar of the rollers. You do not immediately move. It takes a long, agonizing moment for the instruction to travel from your deafened eardrums down through your exhausted spine and into your heavy legs. You slowly rack your steel rod. You turn and begin the long, heavy walk down the metal stairs, the vibrations slowly fading from your bones. You punch your time card. You walk out of the heavy factory doors into the cool, dark air of the early morning. You drag your stiff, abrasive clothes down the quiet street, leaving a faint, microscopic trail of glass dust behind you, a ghost walking away from a machine that will simply keep pouring the river without you. The mechanical, deafening roar of the industrial rollers finally grinds to a halt in your memory, replaced by a silence so thick and absolute it physically presses against your eardrums. You are no longer breathing in vaporized machine oil or dodging molten slag. You are breathing in the stagnant, suffocating scent of wilting lily, stale camphor, and old floor wax, a combination that confidently announces someone has either died or is hosting a very depressing tea party. You are standing in the deeply shadowed parlor of a late 19th century townhouse. It is 2 a.m. Upstairs, the floorboards have just stopped creaking. The physician has finally departed by the back door, his black leather bag heavy with useless instruments. The master of the house, or perhaps the child, has drawn their final rattling breath. The long, agonizing vigil of illness is over. Now, the quiet, bureaucratic administration of grief must immediately begin. You are a weary relative, or perhaps simply the exhausted housekeeper, and you have just been handed a massive, heavy bolt of stiff black morning crepe. Your immediate, non-negotiable task is to walk alone through the freezing, silent corridors of the house and blind every single mirror. It is a widely accepted historical fact that throughout the Victorian era, strict mourning etiquette demanded that the moment a death occurred within a household, all reflective surfaces had to be immediately draped in heavy cloth or physically turned around to face the wallpaper. You are not allowed to wait for sunrise or for the undertaker to arrive. You must do it right now, while the corpse is still warm in the bed upstairs, before the spirit has a chance to wander down into the sitting room. The prevailing superstition dictates that a newly departed soul is deeply disoriented, hovering in the cold corners of the rooms it once inhabited. If it catches sight of its own reflection in a looking-glass, it will become mesmerized, drawn directly into the cold silver depth, and trapped inside the glass forever, unable to cross over. It is a rather insulting theological concept, assuming the immortal human spirit is essentially a metaphysical parakeet that might fly into a shiny surface and forget how to reach the afterlife. But you do not argue with theology at 2 a.m. You simply obey. You unroll the stiff black fabric. You drag a heavy, claw-footed wooden chair to the towering pier glass positioned between the heavy velvet parlor drapes. Your joints ache with a dull, throbbing fire from days of sitting rigidly by the sickbed. You reach up, your arms trembling with severe fatigue, and drape the heavy crepe over the ornate, gilded frame. An obscure and deeply unsettling detail of this mandatory process is the physical nature of Victorian mourning crepe itself. It is a harsh, crimped silk, heavily treated with toxic mordants, lead, and frequently arsenic to maintain its deep, light-absorbing blackness and stiff, scratchy texture. As you wrestle with yard after yard of the fabric in the dim light, the friction causes it to shed a fine, invisible toxic dust. It leaches a dark, sticky dye directly onto your sweating palms and underneath your fingernails. You are honoring the dead by slowly poisoning your own pores with cheap chemical dye, which is, if nothing else, at least thematically consistent. You step down from the wooden chair. The parlor mirror is completely covered, but the room does not feel safer. It actually feels substantially worse. A draped mirror does not look like a piece of hidden furniture. It looks exactly like a tall, silent figure standing motionless in the corner of the room, wearing a shroud. The glass underneath the cloth seems to hold a vacuum, a cold, expectant void just waiting for you to make a mistake. You carry your bolt of toxic silk out into the main hallway. The gas lamps have been turned down to a minimal, hissing blue flicker. The air is entirely stagnant. The windows have been firmly latched shut to prevent the soul from being accidentally blown away on a draft, leaving you to swelter in your high-collared wool clothing. You approach the large, oval looking-glass by the front door. You are terrified of looking into it before you can throw the cloth over the glass. What if you look in, and the face looking back is not your own exhausted visage? What if you see the deceased standing quietly on the stairs behind you, confused and waiting for an explanation? You approach the glass with your eyes squeezed tightly shut, feeling your way along the cold flocked wallpaper, blindly throwing the black fabric forward until you feel it catch on the carved wooden frame. You are playing a terrifying, silent game of blind man's bluff with the afterlife, and you are rapidly losing your nerve. Historians still argue whether this obsessive frantic need to veil the mirrors stemmed from a genuine theological terror of roaming easily distracted spirits, or if it was simply a practical psychological mercy designed to spare the exhausted, weeping relatives the sudden indignity of catching sight of their own swollen, deteriorating faces in the glass. When you have not slept in 4 days, your own reflection is a horror. You simply do not possess the emotional bandwidth to process. You move slowly up the narrow, creaking back stairs to the bedrooms. Here, the mirrors are smaller, sitting passively on washstands and mahogany dressing tables. As you cover a small, silver-backed hand mirror, your elbow brushes violently against a glass perfume bottle. It wobbles precariously on the edge of the table. Your breath completely catches in your throat. You lunge, catching the crystal base just a fraction of an inch before it tips over the edge. The terror of shattering glass in this house is absolute. If you were to drop the mirror itself, shattering the silvered glass onto the wooden floorboards, the ancient superstition insists you would incur 7 years of bad luck. The Romans believed human life renewed itself in 7-year cycles, and breaking a reflection meant physically breaking your current cycle of vitality. But breaking a mirror tonight, in a house where the metallic scent of death is already settling permanently into the curtains, the domestic servants whisper that a shattered mirror in a house of mourning guarantees another death will follow within the year. The fragile glass is practically holding back a dam of tragedy. You carefully drape a small white cloth over the final hand mirror. You have walked through the entire house, systematically blinding it room by room. The home is completely devoid of reflection. There is nowhere left to check your hair, nowhere to straighten your collar, nowhere to confirm that you are still physically present in the room. You stand alone in the upstairs hallway, your hands stained a bruised, chemical black, surrounded by shrouded shapes that look like waiting ghosts. The house has been entirely closed off from the outside world and from itself. You are utterly exhausted, a dull, rhythmic ache settling directly behind your eyes, yet sleep is a luxury that has been indefinitely postponed. You lean your heavy head against the damp wall, listening to the suffocating, unnatural silence of the draped house. You keep your eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards, quietly terrified that despite all the heavy black, crepe, and your meticulous, desperate labor, the cold glass might have already caught something you couldn't see locking it inside the dark, silver just waiting for someone to pull the curtain back. The heavy, black mourning crepe slowly dissolves into a blinding, shadowless white. You are no longer navigating the dark, superstitious corners of a Victorian parlor, terrified of ghosts trapped in the glass. You are standing under the aggressive, flickering hum of fluorescent strip lighting in a late 20th century industrial cleanroom. The air here does not smell of stale camphor, dying lily, or even the sharp ammonia of the early chemical labs. It does not smell of anything at all. It has been violently scrubbed, pushed relentlessly through high-efficiency particulate air filters, and entirely stripped of all character, moisture, and dust. It is a dead, clinical breeze that dries out your sinuses and leaves a faint, static charge on your teeth. You are wearing a white, synthetic full bodysuit, tightly gathered at the wrists and ankles, accompanied by a hairnet, a paper face mask, and tight latex gloves. Your breath bounces off the inside of the mask, blowing warm, humid, recycled air directly back into your own tired eyes. You are essentially a biological hazard wrapped in Tyvek, heavily monitored by the facility to ensure you do not casually flake off a microscopic dead skin, cell, and ruin a perfectly good sheet of silica. It is a profound demotion from master artisan to localized contamination event. Before you sits the absolute culmination of thousands of years of human reflection. It is not a crucible of molten bronze, nor a toxic pool of quicksilver, nor an unstable beaker of fulminating silver. It is a massive stainless steel vacuum chamber, roughly the size of a commercial delivery van. It is cold, heavy, and completely indifferent to your presence. It is a widely accepted historical fact that the commercial mirror industry fundamentally shifted in the mid-20th century by adopting physical vapor deposition, a technique pioneered in the 1930s by physicist John Strong to safely illuminize the massive glass mirrors of astronomical telescopes. Instead of relying on wet, unstable chemistry, Strong realized you could simply boil aluminum until it vaporized, letting the metallic fog gently coat the glass. This dry, physical process eventually trickled down from mountaintop observatories to the mass production of everyday vanity. But you cannot simply boil aluminum in the open air. If vaporized aluminum molecules touch oxygen, they instantly react, creating a dull, useless oxide dust that falls to the floor like gray snow. To make a modern mirror, you must first completely remove the atmosphere itself. You reach out with a gloved, trembling finger, not trembling from the neurological rot of heavy metals this time, but simply from the agonizing flat-footed fatigue of standing on a hard concrete floor for 9 hours. and you press a green illuminated button on the control console. Deep inside the machinery, the roughing pumps engage with a low, bone-rattling thud. They begin the slow, methodical violence of sucking the air out of the sealed steel chamber. You stand with your hands behind your back and watch a digital gauge on the panel slowly tick downward, measuring the dropping pressure in torr. An obscure and deeply unsettling detail of this manufacturing process is the physical reality of the void you are casually creating on the factory floor. You are engineering an environment so brutally hostile to biological life that if you were to somehow step inside the chamber while the pumps were running at full capacity, the gases dissolved in your bloodstream would rapidly expand, and your bodily fluids would literally begin to boil at room temperature. You are pressing a button to summon the lethal, breathless vacuum of deep space into a sealed metal box in an industrial park. And you are paid a modest hourly wage entirely to stand still and watch this metal box not contain air, a task that demands all the intellectual rigor of guarding a remarkably boring tomb. Once the pressure drops to a near-perfect vacuum, the second phase automatically begins. Inside the dark chamber, high-voltage electrical currents run through twisted tungsten filaments draped with pure aluminum staples. The tungsten heats up to over 2,000 degrees. In the breathless void, the aluminum does not melt into a liquid. It sublimates. It flashes instantly from a solid metal into a gaseous, invisible cloud of floating atoms. Because there are absolutely no air molecules left inside the chamber to bump into or slow them down, these vaporized aluminum atoms travel in perfectly straight, uninterrupted lines. They fly outward from the burning filament at tremendous speed until they crash violently into the cold, pristine sheets of glass waiting in the dark. They condense instantly upon impact, stacking atom by perfect atom, silently building a flawless, impossibly thin reflective layer. It takes only a few minutes. There is no grinding. There is no scraping. There is no coughing up metallic blood. The machine handles the alchemy with a cold, terrifying precision. Historians still argue whether the mid-20th century perfection of the vacuum deposition process democratized the mirror, finally allowing every citizen on Earth to own a flawless reflection, or if it simply engineered a mass. Clinical narcissism, entirely divorced from the agonizing human labor that used to make vanity so satisfyingly difficult. Looking at the silent, humming steel box, you feel absolutely no connection to the transformation happening inside. You are just a fleshy appendage attached to a timer. The cycle finishes. The machine automatically purges, hissing loudly as it floods the chamber back with normal, atmospheric air. You step forward, unlatch the heavy steel door, and pull it open with a dull, metallic groan. Inside sits a rack holding dozens of finished mirrors. They are spectacular. They are lighter, brighter, and exponentially cheaper than anything the Doge of Venice or the Sun King of France could have ever imagined in their wildest, feverish dreams. The aluminum coating is only a fraction of a micron thick, yet it offers an absolute, uncompromising reflection of the sterile white room behind you. You look directly into the nearest pane of glass. The mirror does not show a soot-stained face, nor bleeding gums, nor the terrified, paranoid eyes of a poisoned artisan fleeing through the Alps. It reflects a nameless, faceless worker, entirely obscured by synthetic white fabric, paper, and latex. Your identity has been completely scrubbed from the process. You have been effectively replaced by the absolute absence of atmospheric pressure, which, to be fair, is significantly better at the job and never complains to management about the chronic, radiating pain in its lower back. The human hand has finally been completely erased from the reflection. You do not touch the raw metal. You do not touch the fragile glass. You simply facilitate the machine's strict schedule. The agonizing, visceral, bloody relationship between the creator and the mirror has been permanently severed by a wall of stainless steel and the indifferent pull of a vacuum pump. You pull the heavy rack out of the chamber, your rubber-soled shoes squeaking sharply on the polished, anti-static linoleum floor. The sound echoes hollowly in the vast, empty cavern of the cleanroom. You slide a fresh rack of empty, transparent glass into the chamber, close the heavy steel door, and lock the latch. You reach out, your shoulder aching with a dull, repetitive strain that isn't heroic, historic, or tragic, just endlessly, mind-numbingly dull. You press the green button again. You stand quietly under the buzzing fluorescent light, trapped in the sterile hum, and wait for the machine to quietly build another batch of perfect, soulless infinity. The mechanical, deafening roar of the industrial rollers finally grinds to a halt in your memory, replaced by a silence so thick and absolute it physically presses against your eardrums. You are no longer breathing in vaporized machine oil or dodging molten slag. You are breathing in the stagnant, suffocating scent of wilting lily, stale camphor, and old floor wax, a combination that confidently announces someone has either died or is hosting a very depressing tea party. You are standing in the deeply shadowed parlor of a late 19th century townhouse. It is 2 a.m. Upstairs, the floorboards have just stopped creaking. The physician has finally departed by the back door, his black leather bag heavy with useless instruments. The master of the house, or perhaps the child, has drawn their final rattling breath. The long, agonizing vigil of illness is over. Now, the quiet, bureaucratic administration of grief must immediately begin. You are a weary relative, or perhaps simply the exhausted housekeeper, and you have just been handed a massive, heavy bolt of stiff black morning crepe. Your immediate, non-negotiable task is to walk alone through the freezing, silent corridors of the house and blind every single mirror. It is a widely accepted historical fact that throughout the Victorian era, strict mourning etiquette demanded that the moment a death occurred within a household, all reflective surfaces had to be immediately draped in heavy cloth or physically turned around to face the wallpaper. You are not allowed to wait for sunrise or for the undertaker to arrive. You must do it right now, while the corpse is still warm in the bed upstairs, before the spirit has a chance to wander down into the sitting room. The prevailing superstition dictates that a newly departed soul is deeply disoriented, hovering in the cold corners of the rooms it once inhabited. If it catches sight of its own reflection in a looking-glass, it will become mesmerized, drawn directly into the cold, silvered depth, and trapped inside the glass forever, unable to cross over. It is a rather insulting theological concept, assuming the immortal human spirit is essentially a metaphysical parakeet that might fly into a shiny surface and forget how to reach the afterlife. But you do not argue with theology at 2 a.m. You simply obey. You unroll the stiff black fabric. You drag a heavy, claw-footed wooden chair to the towering pier glass positioned between the heavy velvet parlor drapes. Your joints ache with a dull, throbbing fire from days of sitting rigidly by the sickbed. You reach up, your arms trembling with severe fatigue, and drape the heavy crepe over the ornate, gilded frame. An obscure and deeply unsettling detail of this mandatory process is the physical nature of Victorian mourning crepe itself. It is a harsh, crimped silk, heavily treated with toxic mordants, lead, and frequently arsenic to maintain its deep, light-absorbing blackness and stiff, scratchy texture. As you wrestle with yard after yard of the fabric in the dim light, the friction causes it to shed a fine, invisible toxic dust. It leaches a dark, sticky dye directly onto your sweating palms and underneath your fingernails. You are honoring the dead by slowly poisoning your own pores with cheap chemical dye, which is, if nothing else, at least thematically consistent. You step down from the wooden chair. The parlor mirror is completely covered, but the room does not feel safer. It actually feels substantially worse. A draped mirror does not look like a piece of hidden furniture. It looks exactly like a tall, silent figure standing motionless in the corner of the room, wearing a shroud. The glass underneath the cloth seems to hold a vacuum, a cold, expectant void, just waiting for you to make a mistake. You carry your bolt of toxic silk out into the main hallway. The gas lamps have been turned down to a minimal, hissing blue flicker. The air is entirely stagnant. The windows have been firmly latched shut to prevent the soul from being accidentally blown away on a draft, leaving you to swelter in your high-collared wool clothing. You approach the large, oval looking-glass by the front door. You are terrified of looking into it before you can throw the cloth over the glass. What if you look in, and the face looking back is not your own exhausted visage? What if you see the deceased standing quietly on the stairs behind you, confused and waiting for an explanation? You approach the glass with your eyes squeezed tightly shut, feeling your way along the cold flocked wallpaper, blindly throwing the black fabric forward until you feel it catch on the carved wooden frame. You are playing a terrifying, silent game of blind man's bluff with the afterlife, and you are rapidly losing your nerve. Historians still argue whether this obsessive frantic need to veil the mirrors stemmed from a genuine theological terror of roaming easily distracted spirits, or if it was simply a practical psychological mercy designed to spare the exhausted, weeping relatives the sudden indignity of catching sight of their own swollen, deteriorating faces in the glass. When you have not slept in 4 days, your own reflection is a horror you simply do not possess the emotional bandwidth to process. You move slowly up the narrow, creaking back stairs to the bedrooms. Here, the mirrors are smaller, sitting passively on washstands and mahogany dressing tables. As you cover a small, silver-backed hand mirror, your elbow brushes violently against a glass perfume bottle. It wobbles precariously on the edge of the table. Your breath completely catches in your throat. You lunge, catching the crystal base just a fraction of an inch before it tips over the edge. The terror of shattering glass in this house is absolute. If you were to drop the mirror itself, shattering the silvered glass onto the wooden floorboards, the ancient superstition insists you would incur 7 years of bad luck. The Romans believed human life renewed itself in 7-year cycles, and breaking a reflection meant physically breaking your current cycle of vitality. The domestic servants whisper that a shattered mirror in a house of mourning guarantees another death will follow within the year. The fragile glass is practically holding back a dam of tragedy. You carefully drape a small white cloth over the final hand mirror. You have walked through the entire house, systematically blinding it room by room. The home is completely devoid of reflection. There is nowhere left to check your hair, nowhere to straighten your collar, nowhere to confirm that you are still physically present in the room. You stand alone in the upstairs hallway, your hands stained a bruised, chemical black, surrounded by shrouded shapes that look like waiting ghosts. The house has been entirely closed off from the outside world and from itself. You are utterly exhausted, a dull, rhythmic ache settling directly behind your eyes, yet sleep is a luxury that has been indefinitely postponed. You lean your heavy head against the damp wall, listening to the suffocating, unnatural silence of the draped house. You keep your eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards, quietly terrified that despite all the heavy black, crepe, and your meticulous, desperate labor, the cold glass might have already caught something you couldn't see locking it inside the dark, silver just waiting for someone to pull the curtain back.